Welcome to session 6B in the plenary. The question for today's panel is long and might require just a little explanation. The question is, why do modern military decision-making logics attempt to render all aspects of warfare within an analytic, scientific framework that permits reductionist aids such as DIME, an acronym for Defense, Informational, Military, and Economic? I think the real question is DIME as an acronym effective in the new GPC environment? To help answer this question and others, we have assembled an expert panel, including a return engagement by Command Chief Master Sergeant Greg Smith, the senior leader at USSOCOM, and Dr. Tom Searle, a now retired career Special Forces officer and violent extremist organizations expert, presently working in the USSOCOM J5. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, General Howard. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak at this forum. The overarching project for this morning is supposed to be achieving intellectual overmatch, and that's a pretty heady goal. And the question that the General started us off with about that first word, why, is about methods of thinking and about how we go about thinking. And again, to try to achieve that intellectual overmatch, we need to start understanding better the way we think and the sorts of problems it creates for us, the sorts of mistakes we're likely to repeat as a result of the way we think. And DIME is a vehicle, handy vehicle for us to take a look at that. So let's talk about one of the last words in the original question the General brought up. Reductionism. Reductionism is the method of problem solving that I think most of us were taught in school, and it's an enormously powerful one. The fundamental idea of reductionism is that when you're confronted with an enormous, complex, complicated problem and you don't know what to do with it, what you do is you break that huge problem into smaller and smaller problems until eventually you have lots and lots of very small, simple problems, and then you solve all those small, simple problems, reassemble all those solutions into a global solution for the large, enormous problem that you couldn't wrap your head around initially. Now, that is the method that modern science and engineering rely upon, and it is enormously powerful. It put the electric lights over my head in this room. It built the microphone and the cameras and all the things we're using here today. And in general, it is a fabulous tool. It has made an enormous number of inventions possible. However, it's also prone to certain errors. And if we are not satisfied with the sorts of answers we're coming up with to the problems we're facing, then taking another look at reductionism might be a good place to start, because again, it leads us in particular directions and towards certain sorts of predictable errors. So now, moving on to DIME. The DIME, as I'm sure all of you are already aware, refers to diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, and this is, at least aspires to describe all of the aspects of national power and break them into those four bins. Now, as you can imagine, as reductionism, this is pretty severe. There's a potentially infinite number of different types of aspects of national power, especially when you're talking about nations of billions of people. In the case of China, you're talking about economies running into trillions of dollars. There's an enormous number of different ways you could describe all those aspects of national power, and trying to divide it up into only four obviously is going to create some problems. One of those is that each bin is going to be too large. Another is that there's going to be significant gaps between the different bins. But DIME has some great advantages as well. One of the main ones for an audience like this one that's predominantly military is that obviously military is only one of the four, and it is great for breaking us out of a myopic military lens. And note that each service is only a small piece of that M. Each specialization within each service is only a very small piece of that M. And thus it gives us, I think, it should at least, give us a certain humility about what each aspect can achieve on its own and the need to work with other aspects along the DIME continuum. Now, DIME, like any checklist, is also, it's really good at helping you remember the things that are on the list. It's really bad at helping you identify and remember the things that didn't get on the list. And so in order to try to add some things, try to enhance the value of DIME, some people have expanded it to DIME fill by adding financial intelligence and law enforcement and so on. And again, all of those efforts to expand the mnemonic device are efforts to try to incorporate more aspects of reality into that device, but at a certain stage then it becomes too big for us to manage. So that's the constant struggle with these. Now, one of the greatest dangers of trying to use the DIME model is to see each one of your categories in isolation and to think that, gosh, if we just make progress along each one of these, or ideally along mine, because again, different departments of the U.S. government tend to be tied to different aspects of that DIME model, that if I make progress along that then all our problems will go away. And DIME is much more effective when you realize that the key to making national power successful is not to progress on one line of effort, but to work all the lines of effort together and to see the interactions between them. That, for example, successful diplomacy will generate the military bases that will make your military aspect, your M, more effective, but that the M can't do that. It can't get those bases on its own. It needs the D, the diplomatic, to make progress on that. Other aspects where you make an error in one category or another will lead you down a difficult path and cause you to lose in other areas. So, for example, before World War I, the Germans decided they wanted to build a big navy. This was a disaster. It was supposed to increase their military power, but what it did was it alienated the British Empire. The British Empire decided to ally itself with France in World War I, and that was one of the key features that led to the German military defeat. So in a sense, every Reichsmark the Kaiser spent on his navy was actually leading him closer not to military success, but towards military defeat, because it was encouraging the Brits to throw in their lot with the French and ultimately the Americans to join them and ultimately defeat him. And to his credit, he understood this right before the start of the war, and he didn't want the Schlieffen Plan to be executed as it was. It was a purely military plan that involved invading Belgium. The Brits had said, hey, if you invade Belgium, we're going to come in on the side of the French. And the Kaiser said, wait a second, you know, this military plan is going to hurt me on the diplomatic side. That's going to have compounding effects. That's going to undermine me on the military side. The General Staff didn't have another plan, and so they went ahead with it. And the rest, as they say, is history. But that interaction between the different elements of the DIME continuum is much more important than any one of those elements by itself. Now, the broader reductionist problem we can also see impacting in other areas. So, for example, what have we done when we started to say we've got a problem with great power competition? Well, we said, gosh, we've got two different great powers. We've got Russia and we've got China. And so we set up separate Russia teams and China teams. Now, if each one of those separate teams, that reductionist model, starts rushing out to try to solve its separate problem, what it's actually going to do is it's going to force Russia and China together. And anybody would tell you that having all of the world's great powers gang up on you would be the worst possible outcome. And yet reductionism is leading us towards approaches that almost guarantee that we will have that outcome. I think I'll pause there and hand it over to Chief Smith.
Well, thanks, Dr. Searle. As always, I learn more ever offer when I'm sitting anywhere near you. So thanks for imparting.
Can I interrupt here for a second? Tom, you're doing my job. Okay? I'm the guy that's supposed to introduce Command Chief Master Sergeant Smith. But the reason I want to do that is because I'd like to compliment you, Greg, on your lunchtime presentation with the other Sergeant Majors yesterday. I thought it was one of the features of yesterday's presentations. Applying theory to practice is what we do here, and I thought you are a great example of doing that. So congratulations, very well done. Now, we'll be interested in your comments.
Well, thank you very much, General Howard and Dr. Searle. As always, I try to just not suck, right? That's at the end of the day, the old Command Sergeant Major who told me, Pat McCauley, a great friend and mentor of mine, as I was replacing him here, he said, don't suck, right? So I will try to live that ethos today as well. And let me say I'm a strategy to task kind of person, so I'll break this down kind of in a very simplistic way. And I'll say that the DIME, the Diplomatic, Informational, Military, and Economic Instruments of National Power, the IOPs, were created as or thought of as a synchronizing effort to synergize and synchronize policy towards an objective. During the mid 80s, it was about the defeat of communism, right? It unified and created unified action. It unified the nation towards an objective. So since 1982 in the United States, we have had 18 national security strategies. You can go to history.defense.gov and download all of them, and I'll summarize them for you because I've done that already, and as I've prepared for different lesson plans and things that we've done. But the 18 national security strategies, the first 4 during the 1980s, had an overarching grand strategy of containment, right? Containment of the Soviet Union, advancement of American values, and that unified those instruments of national power towards an overarching objective of American exceptionalism, right, versus the Soviet Union model. And then in 1989 through 91, as the dismantlement of the Soviet Union and this emergence of a unipolar world throughout the 90s, we had 9 national security strategies throughout the 1990s that were all focused on a grand strategy of engagement, right, with former Warsaw, the Central Asian states, the new global order, and then enlargement, as we saw starting in 96 through the early 2000s, of the expansion, the rapid expansion of NATO and treaties and alliances. And then 9/11 happened, and our next 4 or 5 national security strategies really focused on collective and cooperative security. That became the overarching grand strategy in a lot of ways of the United States. And then in 2017, early 2018, America First as our most latest grand strategy that came out, which created a bit of policy ambiguity of, okay, how do we coalesce around that with free trade agreements and all the different things that we had been assembling over the last 30 years of national security. So the instruments of national power, while if you were to think of them as 4 lines of effort, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, all in coalescing or in harmony, now became like a spaghetti bowl, right? Kind of all jumbled up, not really sure where one starts and one ends, and as we work through that. At the same time, in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin appeared every year in February of every year, there's the Munich Security Conference where all the world leaders come through and discuss the state of affairs of the global order, if you will. And President Putin directly challenged American exceptionalism and unipolarity in a multipolar world and said, I challenge this. This is the first direct challenge to United States policy and the instruments of national power that, that we're talking about today. Follow that up, the 18th Party Congress, in which this was in 2012, when Xi Jinping took over as the premier and president and chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, where he talked about his Chinese dream and the view of where China would be going forward into 2025 and 2049. Xi Jinping immediately followed that up with a speech in Almaty, Kazakhstan, where he talked about forming a Silk Road economic belt and a free trade, expanding and developing space in the Eurasian region, building an economic belt along this ancient Silk Road. A month later in Jakarta, he said he is ready to open itself wider to the ASEAN countries and build a maritime Silk Road. Now, I want you to think about this nested under the instruments of national power. Xi Jinping leveraged economic, diplomatic, and then the massive information space of the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road. At the time, One Belt, One Road, now it's rebranded as the Belt and Road Initiative, right? 74 signatory countries, $7 trillion underwritten by the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, tying multiple nations together, challenging American exceptionalism. So when you think about things in the era of great power competition, you see Russia right now, and we talk about gray zone and hybrid warfare and all these pieces. This is really diplomatic and informational led. And then Russia's massive oil and gas reserves fueling Europe's economies and emerging economies down in Africa and in the Central Asian area, moving down into Southeast Asia. The massive growth of Chinese dependence on oil and gas and petroleum for its bloating economy now as it grows at an exponential rate. These things are in direct competition with American exceptionalism and the American enduring national interests that have persisted of security, the defense of our nation and our allies and our citizens abroad, prosperity, our system of market-based capitalism and goods and how we bring goods to the market across the global commons, values, our system of democracy and American exceptionalism abroad, our human rights, environmental, equal rights, trade, vetting policies, and then in many cases, most importantly for this discussion, international order. America's place in treaties and alliances and across the global commons to instill an international order. You heard then Secretary Mattis and then Chairman Dunford back in 2017 and 18 discuss this at great depth when discussing the evolution of American policy, because everything had been a capital M in the instruments of national power. The military had become the easy button to solve every problem. Whereas we now see diplomacy and information becoming extremely, not that they weren't, but becoming extremely important in this context of great power competition. And that's caused, from the strategy to task, from the military, remember, that's caused a great degree of ambiguity, because the force we've built and the force that we have honed over the last 20 years has been primarily violent extremist organization focused and very direct action focused. So as Special Operations Command and the military at writ large prepare for the eventuality of the potential for high-end conflict against state competitors that may or may not ever happen, that we have to have a bias for understanding versus a bias for action. And the only way you do that is to make the big M a small m, or really a medium M, right, in support of the diplomatic and informational efforts, because all of those things are vital to the E, the economic engine that drives our nation. So when I think the strategy to task of the instruments of national power and great power competition, I think about the coalescing of American or U.S. policy to support our economic engine, leveraging our diplomatic missions abroad, an alignment of policy, narrated through a common narrative in the informational space, underwritten and supported by our system of treaties and alliances and our place like we saw yesterday with our international allies and partners that allows the American military to go where very, very few people can go. So that's kind of my opening salvo, if you will, on what I think of when I think of the instruments of national power and great power competition. Dr. Howard, General Howard, back to you, sir.
Thank you very much. What a great presentation. I'm going to start off the questioning with my own question. And that is, Dr. Searle, Tom, you mentioned dime fill as perhaps an analytic. It seems to me that one of the shortcomings of dime is they don't use the term intelligence, which dime fill does. And I think in the great power competition environment that we face now, intelligence may be one of the most important analytics. And I would like for both of you maybe to comment on that. And really, what is wrong with dime fill? Maybe would that, even as an analytic, would that not be adequate for what the great power competition of today? So the question is for both of you, and you can, Tom, why don't you start it off?
Yes, thank you, General Howard. Yes, the intelligence aspect is enormously important. The question is sometimes what exactly we mean by the intelligence. Do we mean secret information or information that some other party was trying to keep secret from us? Do we mean just reading the newspaper and figuring out what's going on, or watching the social media feeds and getting a sense of what people are thinking and doing out there? Clearly, without an understanding of what the other parties are doing, it is very difficult to compete. And I think if you look at Russian and Chinese national security strategies, it's very much tied to what we're doing. And very much focused on trying to understand where the Americans are, what they're up to, and how to keep that from interfering with what the Chinese and Russians want to do. And so obviously returning the favor of focusing on figuring out what the other guy is up to is always a good place to start. There are, of course, challenges with it because even with near perfect information, you can still make dumb decisions. And so I think, we need to have more humility than we often do about how much better understanding will provide us the easy button to instant success. So, for example, let's take one incident we're all pretty familiar with. A guy named Bashar al-Assad is out there in Syria. He has forgotten more about Syria than any U.S. cabinet official ever will know about it. And yet he pretty well bungled the most important event in recent Syrian history, that is to say, the events coming after the Arab Spring and the subsequent. He got himself a civil war that has required him to destroy most of his country, has required assistance from both Iran and Russia just to keep him in power. I mean, clearly his performance has been catastrophically bad, and it wasn't because he didn't know enough about Syria. He knew quite a lot. We'll never know that much about our foreign policy challenges as he knew about Syria. I hope to God we never make a decision as dumb as the ones he made in managing his own population there and getting himself the civil war that's currently causing his problems. So I think we also need, in our quest for that intelligence and that more perfect knowledge, we also need to have a little humility about the notion that somehow if we just knew a little bit more, all of our problems would become simple problems. No, they'll still be complicated, complex problems, and we may still make a mess of it, even with perfect information. Let me turn it over to the Chief.
Well, thanks, sir. I always, when we talk about intelligence, again, from the troops to task, I always say, are we talking noun or verb? And what I mean by that is, are we talking about intelligence as a policy, intelligence as information, or intelligence as tradecraft, right? Because they mean different things to different people, and there's a reaction when it comes to under the instruments of national power. If we were to add, like Dr. Searle eloquently brought up, the financial intelligence and legal or law enforcement (FIL) piece of that was really added at Army War College several years ago, right? So Dr. Bartholomew's did a great job of this in a couple of foreign power, American policy things that you can find on Strategic Studies Institute. I know that those are some great reads. But when you think about the intelligence as an instrument of national power, it's really, we talk about indications and warnings, really, of the global environment. Right? So intelligence could be, is there a pandemic coming? Is there this? Is there a threat to the order, whatever that global order is? So, and then intelligence as an action verb, meaning what am I going to do about that? You know, as Clausewitz talks about the 4 elements of friction, the second one being information or intelligence that affects your decision-making ability. So the lack of intelligence or information in the global commons will affect American policy, in this case, in great power competition. So let's apply that real quick to state competitors. We'll use Russia and China in this case. Is what is Russia's end, right? And the ends, ways, and means construct. What are Russia's ends? Is it merely to achieve, great power status and recognition and multipolarity, or is it the dismantlement or destruction of American institutions or pillars? Those are very different things. So can we coexist? Or is this about recognition or dismantling, our system? Those are different things. So understanding the ends from an intelligence perspective. With China, is the South China Sea island building of the Paracel Islands, the Scarborough Shoal, Spratly Islands, right? So the maritime militia, is that an expansion of the economic exclusion zone and special exclusion zones, right? So does the flag follow trade? Or is trade following the flag? Is this about expansionism, if you will, using military and China's now blue water fleet to kind of start to do these things? Is the distant water fishing fleet really just about providing sustenance, or is it about pushing into the Galapagos or off the coast of South America or off the coast of Africa and depleting resources for Chinese advantages? Understanding those things, so the intelligence behind that should help inform and shape policy. And until we have an alignment of what our ends are in terms of intelligence, it'll hamstring or it'll inhibit American actions to counter those things. So I'll stop there, General Howard.
Great answers. We have some questions from the audience, which I will give to you. First, and it's kind of interesting, it plays on, Greg, your medium M. So does our annual budget support this concept of, and it's dime, but it's big D, big I, little m, and big E, or does it support a concept of little d, little I, big M, and little e? So Greg, I'll ask that of you first, and Tom, you can answer too if you'd like.
So General Howard, I love this question, and I'll go back to 2005, which I believe was the height of American alignment, if you will, for lack of a better term. If you look at the defense budget from 2005 into 2006, a pretty important thing happened in 2006 with the National Defense Authorization Act, and that was Section 1207, which allowed us to transfer money between Department of Defense to Department of State for capacity building, if you will, became the Global Security Contingency Fund, became Security Sector Fund, and then was dismantled in 2012 with the NDAA. It finally had run out and was not renewed. But we lost the ability to synchronize between diplomacy and military. Right? All warfare is policy, it's politics by other means, right? Continuation of policy by other means. I read that somewhere as well once upon a time. But we have become very military-centric in our approach. And when you have a hammer, everything's a nail, and I think we're incredibly effective, but we need to reassume a supporting role. And with a $736 billion budget versus, Department of State's, $100 billion, it's significant, or $50 billion, significant staff overmatch without the ability to forward that. I think then Secretary Clinton's quadrennial diplomacy defense review, I thought that was a great opportunity to align state and defense in terms of policy, and we've since kind of moved away from that. So again, going back to the instruments, our diplomatic and military have got to kind of realign if we're going to compete on the global stage. Dr. Searle?
Obviously, sort of the worst case was sequestration, where the military budget is put on autopilot and it becomes inflexible and simply churns ahead without the ability to redirect funds even within DOD, let alone between departments. I think if we take a somewhat broader, more holistic look at, say, the West rather than just the U.S., that imbalance between the military and the diplomatic starts to balance out a little bit more, because a lot of the Europeans who we continuously complain about not spending enough on defense, well, they're spending more on the diplomatic side. They're making a bigger contribution on the information side in a lot of cases than they are on the military side, and that's great. And they're, I think, developed over time a certain amount of division of labor, almost inadvertently, between different like-minded nations, democracies, for lack of a better term. And that may have started to break down under the current administration. And that's unfortunate because, again, we were able to leverage those other aspects of other folks' diplomacy pushing in the same direction. So even though we weren't giving foreign aid to certain countries at the levels that ideally we should have, a lot of times some of the Europeans were filling in some of that gap. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay. One quick follow-up. I would encourage everybody to go to foreignassistance.gov. Right, so www.foreignassistance.gov, and just take a look at that. You can take your cursor around and look at the different countries, and you can see where our diplomatic and economic impact is globally, and think about that under these instruments. General Howard, back to you, sir.
So these are questions from the audience. They may need a little interpretation, so I don't want to offend anybody that's sending the questions in, but in fact, the next one is really not a question. It's two statements, and they want to know your thoughts about these statements. So the first statement is, walking away from the table of treaties does not help the USA, and I guess that's under the D. And enforcement of sanctions also takes a toll, which is probably D and E. So the person asking the question wants to know what your thoughts are on walking away from treaties and enforcing sanctions. So Tom, would you start us off, please?
It's a challenging problem there. I mean, well, I remember in Iraq, the joke was that after a big meeting, the military guys would say, wow, that was a great meeting. Now let's get to work. And the State Department guys would say, wow, that was a great meeting. That was hard work. That for State Department, for the diplomacy, the meeting is the work. That is the event. And having a signed treaty, good, bad, or otherwise, is a good thing, regardless of what the treaty says. I think obviously there have to be treaties that you're unwilling to sign, so you have to be willing to walk away in order to get what you want from the diplomatic end. So I would not want to say that it's never worthwhile to refuse to sign, to continue the bargaining process through the walk-away process. The Palestinians and the Israelis have walked away from each other innumerable times. Somehow they always manage to come back later on. Now, they haven't made a whole lot of progress, in fairness, but walking away from a treaty, the fact is that the country, the issue that that the treaty was about or the discussion was about, those don't go away. They're still going to be there. And so eventually there will be another table and another opportunity, and so there will be an interaction there. I think I'll stop there and turn it over to the Chief.
So I want to be very careful because I would also add tariffs, right? So table of treaties, sanctions, and tariffs of all things, right? And when you look at our current policy about American prosperity being the cornerstone, right? So I would caution us that we're in the second inning of a 9-inning game, even though it feels like it's end game. So in that thread, though, as we withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP is a good example, and China comes right behind it and kind of certifies and ratifies the China-Indo-China Economic Corridor, right? So a free trade agreement between China and the town of Kunming down in the southern part of China, all the way down into Malaysia, Laos, all the whole area. As we withdraw from economic treaties or levy tariffs on there to level the playing field in terms of American prosperity, right? So this instrument of national power, I'm sure our chiefs of mission, ambassadors, that may or may not be listening would greatly argue, because it makes their mission much more difficult as we withdraw in many cases from some of these things. But we don't know the ultimate outcome. If you go back to 1994, and I think you guys remember 1996, the bumper sticker was "It's the economy, stupid." You remember that during the Clinton re-election campaign? And we had a National Security Council and a National Economic Council. That was important. What was happening is we were grossly expanding our trade, and you saw General Motors and Ford opening factories in China and all around the world. And that came at the expense of American factories because the labor cost and the cost to produce was just so much cheaper. So while the investor made significant money, the American infrastructure suffered as a consequence of it. So under the economic engine, the second inning of this 9th inning of the economic story of America, we have the infrastructure. We don't have the underwriting because we've outsourced that. So this table of treaties revocation or revisit, for lack of a better term, and then the sanctions and tariffs that go along with it are all part of that. Now, the question is, how is policy going to coalesce, and what role will diplomacy and information play in that, in preparing the global environment for what is to come that we don't know, and what the military should be a supporting and a very little in that. And unfortunately, as General Howard, as you brought up, is we're kind of stuck in the medium to big M role in this state competitor along the global commons. Pending your questions. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just follow up on that. One of the things we forget is that in the Cold War, in that aspect of competition, it was desperately important for us that West Germany be richer and more successful than East Germany, that South Korea be richer and better off than North Korea, etc. All our allies, we wanted to make sure that they were successful. And what that meant was that we were willing to sign treaties that were unfair, that we were willing to sign economic deals that were not as advantageous to us domestically as they could have been, and that cut a good deal to our partners because we wanted them to succeed. Their success in competition was our success. The current administration has tried to revisit that without, unfortunately, acknowledging why we would have been happy to sign unfair deals once upon a time. It wasn't stupidity, it wasn't ignorance, it wasn't a failure of policy, it was policy. It was that we wanted our partners to succeed. And that's one of the things that made us the partner of choice, was that we were willing to sign treaties that didn't advantage us as much as they could have. And there's a price to be paid for that. And that's one of the things missing in the DIME model, is that domestic piece. And if all of your things you can and can't do in the foreign realm are based on your domestic strength, then that domestic strength needs to be incorporated into your assessment of national power. And DIME on its own essentially doesn't do that. Thank you.
So we have an interesting question from the audience, and based on your comments so far, I think this is very appropriate. The question is, in the DIME environment, and based on comments yesterday about what is the end state of GPC, is the ends, ways, and means model relevant to the present framework, international security environment framework? So, Greg, you want to start us off on that, because you did mention ends, ways, and means in your comments.
Yes, sir. So I'm a Clausewitz zealot, right? So I subscribe and regularly adhere to the ends, ways, and means model. I will tell you that the challenge with the ends, ways, and means model, and I'll use Simon Sinek for this with the infinite game, right? Is state competition, global competition is an infinite game. There is no definable end state because the global order is in constant flux. So if I were going to read two books, we'd start with Why by Simon Sinek, followed by The Infinite Game, and understand the concepts behind those, and then I would apply those to Clausewitz's On War, right, which is my #1 book of all time. It's sad but true, but anybody that knows me knows that. But when you look at our means, and I think the instruments of national power are both our ways and our means, depending on how you look at this, right? And it's just in what thread in which you're doing that. So if I just take DIME in its very simplistic form, I would tell you that, diplomacy across the world, and this prosperity for all under the guise of American exceptionalism or American leadership is really the ends for the United States of strengthen the power of our example. That's written in 5 of our national security strategies of, hey, we believe our system is, while imperfect, the best system in terms of prosperity for all members. Now, if you ask a single mom in small town USA who's struggling to survive, she would tend to disagree with that, right? So, and that's the beauty is her vote counts as much as Jeff Bezos from Amazon in terms of electing our leaders of our highest levels of government. So that's the beauty of American democracy, is it doesn't matter who you are, your opinion counts when it comes to voting. So the ends would be the choice, right? But realistically, it's really the ways and means in which we advance these instruments of national power, if you will, to coalesce around a policy that allows us to achieve those ends. So I believe that during great power competition against the communist Soviet Union back in the 80s, the ends, ways, and means construct worked very well. Ends, ways, and means was written or codified during the Napoleonic Wars, which was great power competition defined in its era. So I believe it's absolutely applicable, in a large great power competition environment. Dr. Searle.
Ends, ways, means, this discussion and the mention of Simon Sinek obviously leads us into the next panel nicely, which is an excellent sort of lead-in. But before that, there are obviously huge challenges in deciding what the ends are. The George H.W. Bush administration did not have the demise of the Soviet Union as an explicit national security goal. It was deeply ambivalent about that as a goal. We've come around to feeling that that was a great thing, but they had not made that an explicit goal, and they were not entirely comfortable with it. Reunification of Germany, all of those things were controversial within the administration, and we may all see them as great successes now, but they weren't the ends that we were pursuing. One of the, a lot of times it's easier to see these things in your opponents than it is in others than it is in yourself, because gosh, we all retroactively try to remember things as being consistent when actually we changed our minds all the time. Let's take Putin in Crimea. Every Russian has wanted Crimea back under the Russian flag since Khrushchev gave it away in the 50s. But nobody really did anything about it. And that wasn't, reclaiming Crimea was not in any of Putin's official national security documents for Russia or in any of his policy speeches or things like that. There was a moment when he decided that, hey, we need to get Crimea back. but that was an end he came up with. And obviously, Russia always could do it. It always had the military force to retake Crimea, but they chose not to for decades, and then suddenly they decided differently. But they changed their ends, and the U.S. intelligence community didn't get the turn indication there about what the new end was. But nobody doubted Russia's ability to do that. It's just that hadn't been one of the Russian ends, and then suddenly became a Russian end, and oops, we're scrambling to try to figure out what to do as a result.
So the following question is an extension of the last question. And so the question is, so then, what is the grand end, purpose and aim of GPC from the USA perspective? Is it more about preservation of an international order, rules of the game, for prosperity and security, for, or to, all those who prescribe to those rules of the game? Or is it about American global primacy as the end in and of itself? Regardless of what it really is, how might this be perceived by others? So I guess there are two sort of options here. Preservation of the international order, rules of the game, for prosperity and security, or is it about American global primacy as the end in itself? So Greg, why don't you start us off on that one?
I'll say yes, right? So let's deconstruct that just a little bit using reductionism, right? And just say that when we think about the enduring national interests of the United States, and you think about it in three lenses of what are we willing to die for, what are we willing to fight for, and what are we willing to pay for, right? So what are vital, what are important, and what are peripheral, in terms of these enduring national interests. So security, the defense of our nation, its citizens abroad, and then those of our allies and partners, right? So kind of nested in that role. This is an infinite question and an infinite game, because it's to what degree are you willing to go? We will die for the security and safety of our nation and American citizens abroad. When you start to get into and our allies and partners, okay, to what degree will we go, right? And that varies based on time and space and where we're at and kind of in the global order. So security, prosperity, are we willing to die for our system of market-based capitalism, right? And that's a good question. Are we willing to fight for it, or are we willing to pay for it? We know we're willing to pay for it, right? Hopefully with low interest rates, by the way, right? Because that affects the capitalist part of it. But, especially as I get close to buying my retirement home, right? It's very important that we keep this, economy moving. But in all seriousness, our system of market-based capitalism and how the American dollar and how American goods compete on the global stage, that becomes important to the economic engine of our nation. And the economic engine is what fuels the security and values, and enables us to do the things we're going to do. Now, values is a hard one, right? Because it's actually really, really easy, but it's really, really hard because you can't pay for it. It has to be ideological in its nature. And in the multipolar world of the United States right now, we're at extreme ends of progressive and conservatism right now, right? And it'll ebb and flow. So I bring all this up because it all affects the international order, that last enduring national interest. So security, prosperity, values, and international order. The international order, the question was about, what is the grand end, right? Or the strategic ends in terms of great power competition. And I'll read you just very quickly one sentence about what the definition of competition is, right? And what we've settled upon. And it's the interaction among actors in pursuit of influence, leverage, and advantage necessary to advance and protect their interests. So just think about that. Influence, leverage, and advantage to advance your respective interests. So where do our interests, if I'm looking at it in a Venn diagram, where do our interests and our allies and partners intersect? Where do our interests with our strategic competitors and potential adversaries intersect? Right? I would argue that Russia is not eager for a military confrontation with the United States, is more about multipolarity with the United States and being treated to that. And maybe that's a unifying effort for the United States to have a strategic competitor on parity because it unites and aligns policy. So the strategic ends, what I believe, are an existing or continuation of the global international order, which favors our economic interests, underwritten by our values as a nation, expanded and advanced throughout the world. So that, what I believe is the infinite game, and how you interpret those becomes very, very difficult based on time and space. Dr. Searle?
Sure. To follow up on what you're saying, Chief, there's one aspect of your last sentence that is problematic, and that is the piece where the current order favors us. If there comes a point where it no longer favors us, the order hasn't changed, but we're no longer put in an advantage by that order, do we then lose interest in that order? And if that is the case, then why should anybody trust us when we're peddling an order that we're only advocating because it favors us? If it's inherently unfair because it favors us, then maybe it's not an order that we're going to have consistent success in selling to others. But you'll notice in that definition of competition that the chief was describing, it never talked about an end. It was advance our interests is why we're doing this. And those interests could change. And there is no end to advance. It's simply going on forever. It's a direction of travel. And even that direction could change if our interests changed over time. And so I think that definition of competition kind of rebels against the question about an end. There is no end. It's a direction. But when you get to the North Star, you keep on going north. And I'd like to suggest another book besides Clausewitz, and that's Thucydides. And Thucydides said that there were 3 reasons nations go to war. So essentially 3 types of vital interests, the things people would kill for or die for. And that was, translating them into current terms, security, prosperity, and values. And so if you wanted to come up with ends, I think you would at least need to have all 3 of those flavors of ends out there. And the Obama administration included those among its lines of effort, but it also added an international order to a 4th line, and said that no, we're actually willing to fight and die and kill for a particular sort of international order. I don't know. The current administration, I think, abandoned that notion in certain ways. I don't know if we'll come back to that. I feel much more confident about the first 3, about values we're willing to fight and die for, security, obviously, and prosperity. But the international order, I'm tougher on, even though that is something that the questioner was asking.
Yeah, so pillar 4 of our most recent national security strategy, advance American influence, right? What does that mean, right? And if you dig into the sum part of it, it's about working with partners, work with reformers, outlining outcomes in multinational forums. So I know it's a reach, right? It's a reach, but I am trying to drive that into this continuation or an international order. If you listen to our current administration, which I think has done a very good job of articulating the end state that they do, which is, hey, no longer are we going to underwrite and underpin, which is problematic to 30 or 50 years or really 70 years of from the Marshall Plan on. It really is a change of direction. So to your North Star piece, you're right. We're kind of we're 4 degrees off of North Star right now, so do we realign to magnetic north, or is this now true north that we're heading? And the answer is, all warfare is an instrument of policy and politics, so our elected leaders will tell us which way true north is, whether we like it or not in some cases, because of how it packages. But yes, sir.
No, and I think that that's wonderful, where increasing our influence, that's a means. Influence is a means, right? And we're making that an end, is increasing our influence without any clear definitions to what the heck we're going to use that influence for, but we sure want more of it. Well, that makes a very peculiar sort of end, right?
That's a great dialogue, gentlemen. This following question might need a little interpretation too, so apologies to the questioner, but I might add a little context. So, the question is, what role in the future GPC does the human capital in relation to demographics play in the future relationship with high birth rate countries and low? Does this start to even further the possibility of Russia and China cooperating in the future? In past decades, I'm going to do a little interpretation now. In past decades, there was a concern that because Russia had such a great natural resources, assets, and comparatively low population, and China had a big population and decreasing natural resource assets, that it might prompt China to invade Siberia, try and take Siberia or that part of Russia. So I guess this question is probably referring to that in a way, but I think the implication is here, because of the demographics of both countries, is there a more likelihood of a symbiotic relationship instead of confrontational relationship? So Tom, can we start with you again, please?
Sure. Obviously, I think that our informational campaigns ought to focus on scaring the heck out of the Russians about the prospect of the Chinese taking over Siberia, and we ought to encourage the Chinese to talk about that a lot, and scare the bejeebus out of the Russians, and the Russians ought to keep emphasizing how important it is to keep the Chinese out, and hence they will fight amongst themselves. So I'm all in favor of those lines of effort on the informational side. The resource piece, I think, is probably not, I think we exaggerate the importance of it. Commodity prices have been on a long-term downward trend across all commodities for as long as we've been measuring commodity prices. Oil was supposed to be different. It turns out not to be different. Gas was, I think, $1.93 when I was driving in this morning. I mean, that's ridiculous. At those kind of levels, who cares who owns it? So I think the resource piece it's easy to exaggerate the importance of that in a world where commodity prices are continuing to go down. And I think that the Belt and Road Initiative represents, in a lot of ways, classic 19th century thinking that may turn out to have been a complete waste of money on the part of the Chinese, but we'll see about that. I liked the beginning of the question where it talked about human capital and birth rates. As we all know, I hope, the most effective birth control ever devised is education for women. And that increases human capital enormously and pushes down birth rates. And so we have this anomaly where the countries with the greatest per capita human capital, where the most educated populations, also have the lowest birth rates, and vice versa. Now, that is going to create a huge demographic problem, and that's creating a migration problem already, and that migration will continue to be a challenge. It's destabilizing Europe already. It will destabilize China in the future. It has obviously caused all sorts of political challenges inside the United States, and will continue to do so. We are just a little more open about those challenges than some of the other folks are. I'll turn it over to Chief.
Yeah, so I'll take a slightly different angle on this, and I will say from human capital. If you look up China's 1,000 Talents program, right, and China has exported significant human capital into academia across the United States, Europe, to go out leveraging their human capital external and then bring that information back. It's, you know, sometimes we call this intellectual espionage as well, right? Because of what purpose is it being done, but really it's taking advantage of the open academic market that's out there for talent. So countries with high birth rates or exploding populations like China right now, and you look at China's plan of attack on this, or really their plan forward on this, is really export it as much as possible and then bring it back to bring the best things back. It's no different than what we've seen over millenniums of emissaries going out and doing this, but this is just through academia. Russia's a little bit different, and the way I look at it is, if you look up Ruski Mir, right, the Russian world, the Russian view, how Russia sees the world from a Slavic-centric, and the diasporas that are out there of ethnic Russians who are now fifth-generation Lithuanians or Estonians or around the world, heck, third-generation Americans that are ethnic Russian. But Ruski Mir is really about Putin's attempt to, you know, and it's not a stretch, it's an attempt to reunite the human capital diaspora under a common Russian narrative or framework of the Russian view of the world. And this is a significant challenge, because the more that you deny voting rights in some of the European countries or some of these other pieces, and the more that you get to a nationalistic framework, the more the potential for isolation of that. And that is what drives these two, China and Russia, together. Let's not forget, you know, 1956 to 66, and really the 1961 Sino-Russian split was a pretty wide chasm, right? I mean, that is a seismic gap there that our policy right now is helping to mend those gaps a little bit. So if we can find some common ground with state competitors, you will start to see this tripolar world in terms of economy and influence. Dr. Searle, I can see you got to follow up on that one.
Well, one of the nice things that we've got when we're talking about Russia and China is that their ideology, if you will, is deeply nationalistic, and that nationalism is ethnocentric, that is race-based and linguistic-based. And the United States is not like that, for that matter. The Soviet Union was not like that in its communist heyday. Communism was an ideology that could appeal to anybody. Being more Han Chinese has a limited appeal to non-Han Chinese. It's very hard to become one if you didn't already start out that way. And so there may actually be, granted there's a whole lot of ethnic Han Chinese out there, but that may create a certain limitation to the appeal in Africa, say, that communism was not running up against. And clearly, I don't know that a whole lot of Africans are anxious to become better Russians either. So, these are not options that are alive to them. So I think that that this is a huge advantage for us in a competition with both of these competitors, and we need to exploit that.
On the way to the airport, I paid $3.53 for a gallon of gas, so we may have a different perspective out there. Granted, it's mostly tax, but still we have a different perspective. This next question has no need for interpretation. It's pretty clear, and I don't know if it came out of the J2 or the J3, but you'll know what I mean when I ask the question. It's very simple. Back in the day, operations led intelligence, and today, intelligence drives operations. Agree or disagree? And I'll let either one of you start with that.
So in great power competition, intel needs to drive ops, right, at the end of the day. I mean, really, information should drive intel. Diplomacy should drive it all, Especially when you're talking about great power competition and low intensity conflict, counterinsurgency operations, it becomes very easy effects based and then, intel based or ops based, depending on the tempo that you're doing. Having 7 years of my life deployed in either, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Somalia, or places in between, I can tell you that ops was driving, intel was giving us the next piece, and then bounce to the next, to the next, to the next, right, as we were dismantling, the network. When you start talking about state competition, it becomes a much different game, if you will, for lack of a better term, but a much different problem set. Dr. Searle?
Now, along those lines, I think that we had an experience there during the height of the recent festivities in Afghanistan, and especially in Iraq, but to a lesser extent in Somalia and a whole lot of other places, where we were conducting so many operations. It was extraordinary, and it was for the old-timers who remember or have even heard of the Sante raid, where they did dozens of rehearsals before conducting one operation. I think we quickly got to the stage where folks were doing dozens of operations per rehearsal. They almost never did a rehearsal. They were always rolling on operations, and it completely changed it. And the relative balance is probably going to shift more towards the intel side, because there's going to be fewer operations, and so the intel is going to have more time to chew on more items. I think usually the challenge we see is the quarrel between the intelligence guys and the operators, where the operators want to go off on any intelligence whatsoever, and the intelligence folks want absolutely exquisite intelligence, and are then even reluctant to approve an operation, because obviously if you conduct the operation, then they have to start from scratch, and they got to find all the how the network responds and find all the new bad guys, and they already know where these bad guys are. It's easy. Their job is easy to monitor that, and so there's always that anxiety there between the, because we're going to destroy all their good intel by acting on it, and vice versa. Okay.
Gentlemen, we have time for one more question, and I don't even know how to reinterpret this, so I'm just going to read it. Recently, Mr. Pompeo, Secretary of State, tried to enforce a snapback with regards to Iran. How would the USA see a special purpose entity being created by the EU or UK core to make a tax haven company to roll out arms to Iran be perceived by the USA? Now, there must be some hidden context there that I don't quite understand or haven't read in the press. But first of all, do you understand the question? And if you do, can you answer it? And if not, we'll move on to another question.
General Howard, I'll take a stab at it. I'm pretty sure I understand the question. The question is, what happens if our ally or people that we're partnered with who don't share the JICPOA or snapback, which is the return of sanctions to Iran for not following the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action original piece, which is really about 3.67 grams of highly enriched uranium, which allows them to do the non-Ches nuclear reactor, those types of nuclear power, but not a nuclear weapon. So what happens if a company within the UK core or the European Union then circumvents or does not subscribe to these snapback stations? What does that do to our partnership? And this is the role and goal of diplomacy, right? It's not a military question at this point, although it could affect military sharing and partnerships, right? So the goal of this is if we see this snapback happen and we see not everybody subscribe to it or other companies circumventing or going around American U.S.-led pieces, then what would happen there? And I think there would be second-order effects in terms of U.S. sharing, some trade and military cooperation that goes similar to Turkey with the S-400 or the SA-21 missile. Right? There's some instant sanctions or offsets that happen there on military cooperation. So.
To take it to a dumber level, if you will, it would be a really bad idea for us to engage in a trade war against one of our major allies over their willingness to accept cash from Iran, especially if we can ensure that the weapons they sell them are not massive game changers. So I think that we will probably politely ignore the fact that they're selling things to the Iranians and selectively enforce sanctions as we always selectively enforce all laws and sanctions.
So we actually do have time for a very quick question. We're very good in talking about dime and dime fill and ends, ways, and means, and trying to apply it to national security strategy, whole of government approach. But one of the, and we're very good at, the United States is very good at measuring the effort in that regard. But one of our shortcomings may be measuring the effects of our policies, dime fill, ends, ways, and means, strategies. Could you comment just for a minute on using measures of effect better so that we don't waste time, money, effort, and lives? And you can use it in a dime fill framework or ends, ways, and means framework if you like. And I think we're going to start with Greg.
So I'll talk very briefly. You know, we're really good at measures of performance, right? How much. We are really good at quantifying the volume of what we do, right? Are we doing things right? Right? I mean, we're really good at that, but we're not really good at measures of effectiveness. Are we doing the right things? And you know, what is the outcome, the so what of that? So strategic MOEs are a significant challenge for us to measure in an infinite game, using that Simon Sinek piece again of how do we do that. So we have to have an overarching national security policy framework that allows us to effectively manage where we're trying to go. Dr. Searle, for interest of time.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, you have an enormous challenge with the metrics. And one of the beauties of measuring your own effort is that obviously you start from zero and you completely control how much effort you do. And you don't have that counterfactual problem. In measures of effect, you have a huge counterfactual problem. That is to say, what would have happened if you didn't do anything? And you can't prove that because you can't rerun the experiment, undo everything you did, get your Wayback Machine, and try running it without your actions. And so things may get worse. For example, I'm going to go to the gym this evening. My performance will be abysmal compared to what it was 40 years ago. What I will do would be an embarrassment to my 20-year-old self. So what? You know, does that mean that all the times I went to the gym between, you know, then and now were wasted because, gosh, I got worse? No, you know, I was going to get worse. That was a given. The question was how much worse and how fast I was going to get worse. And I went to the gym to slow that down, but I didn't, you know, I didn't prevent it. And so, you know, how do you, even in those rare cases when you can measure, and what's our measure of influence? What's our measure of diplomacy? How many treaties we signed? What's our metric for these things? It's very difficult to do that, and it's compounded by that counterfactual challenge.
Gentlemen, what a great panel. Tom, if you don't mind, I'd like to steal that gym analogy from you. It fits me perfectly. Thanks again, gentlemen, for a great panel. Appreciate it very much.